And welcome to Chapter 4, where we focus on DOS or Denial of Service attacks. Basic objectives for Chapter 4: understanding how denial of service attacks or DOS are accomplished, knowing how certain DOS attacks work, such as SYNFLOOD, SMURF, and DDoS, taking specific measures and understanding what those are to protect against denial of service attacks, and knowing how to defend against specific DOS attacks. Denial of service attacks overall, one of the most common types of attacks in the cyber world, second only to virus or worm attacks. And the goal is to prevent legitimate users from accessing a system. However, you must understand how it works and ultimately how to stop it. And so we know computers have physical limitations in terms of the size of files, number of simultaneous users, speed of data transmission, the amount of data stored. And when you exceed any of these operational limits, the computer will cease to respond appropriately. Kind of like only so many cars can go on a highway. If more are allowed, then the safety, speed, and or other qualities of the highway and the highway traffic ultimately begin to suffer. As we look at this example, these are all free tools ultimately available on the internet. Here we have XOIC. Additional opportunities and common tools that are used for denial of service attacks. And coming up, our next slide will show the spatial draft on what we know as the semantic site. And so here we have the image of a threat assessment in process. We are able to see the virus definitions, technical details, any recommendations that are there, and or removal instructions for any type of virus that might be found on our own personal computers and or networks. Ultimately, with DOS weaknesses, a hacker must successfully spoof the source IP. The flood itself, so to speak, must be sustained. And so, in a DOS, as soon as victims' machines are quote-unquote disinfected, ultimately the attack stops. And so in a single attack, the hacker's own machine is at risk of discovery. In this type of DOS attack, a hacker sends out a SYN or SYN packet which wants to open a connection. By law, ultimately, the receiver must respond within a certain period of time with a SYN ACK, ACK, holding space in its buffer for the final ACK. The hacker never sends the final ACK, but sends more illegitimate SYNs, or SYNS. And while the receiving system keeps resources open for that ultimate ACK, the bogus SYNs overflow the buffer or overwrite the legitimate SYNs already in the buffer. And so here we see that phenomena, if you will, in an image. Methods of prevention, one being SYN cookies. This saves the buffer overflow attack. At first, upon receipt of a SYN, no buffer itself is created. The receiver sends SYN ACK containing hashed information in the header. It then receives ACK and checks for confirmation of hash in the header. Only then, at that point, is the buffer created, avoiding allocating resources for false SYNs. However, as in much of the world when it relates to technology, computers, this is extremely resource intensive. We have RST cookies, where this sends a false SYN-ACK back. Should receive an RST back if the original sign or SYN were legitimate. And now you can accept connections from that host because it is legitimate. Ultimately easier to implement, but not compatible with Windows 95. Obviously, many computers being far exceeding beyond Windows 95, but potentially some still in use today. However, this is still not the easiest of methods to use. We have stack tweaking, which is a more complex method. Ultimately, makes an attack difficult, but is in many things not impossible. And we have a Smurf IP attack. Here, a hacker sends out an ICMP broadcast with a spoofed source IP. Hacker sends out ping packets. That spoofed source IP is that of the actual victim. Intermediaries, who are broadcast recipients, then respond to the ICMP with replies. The ICMP echo replies flood victim because of that spoofed source IP. And ultimately, the network can perform a denial of service on one of its own or on itself. And here we see that in graphic mode. The next example, a DHCP starvation, where if enough requests flooded onto the network, an attacker can completely exhaust the address space which are allocated by the DHCP servers for an indefinite period of time. And that's a denial of service attack called a DHCP starvation. We also have an HTTP post, which involves sending a legitimate HTTP post message. But part of that post message is the content length, which indicates the size of the message to follow. In this specific attack, the attacker sends the actual message body at an extremely slow rate. And so in that process, the web server is hung while waiting for the entire message to complete. And so for more robust servers, the attacker needs to send multiple HTTP post messages simultaneously, thus beginning to shut down the system. And we have PDoS, a permanent denial of service attack. Damages the system so badly that the victim machine ultimately needs an operating system reinstall, potentially new hardware. This type of an attack may sometimes be called flashing and usually involves a denial of service attack on the device's firmware. Here, we have a cert listing on a number of Smurf attacks. When we have that protection against Smurf attacks, ultimately, we need to have the adequate AV software guarding against Trojans, ensuring that routers don't forward ICMP broadcasts, and making sure that we utilize proxy servers. In a UDP flood attack, a hacker sends UDP packets to a random port. Because there is no service waiting on that port, the system generates ICMP packets as destination unreachable. And then a flood of the illegitimate UDP packets can cause the system to type the resources, sending back ICMP packets. This is a standard denial of service attack, ultimately slowing down by tying up multiple system resources. And here, another standard denial of service attack, the ICMP flood attack. This example being the POD, or the ping of death. Most systems of today ultimately do not have this vulnerability anymore. With a teardrop attack, a hacker sends a fragmented message. Here, the header has been crafted to instruct the receiving system to reassemble the packet in one of two ways. One, either to overlap the fragments, perhaps crashing the target, and or to leave a gap in the message, ultimately with the same result. Fragmentation is used when the packets must pass along various medium types with differing MTUs, ultimately which may necessitate fragmenting or chopping up larger packets. The simplest of all attacks is the land attack, where a hacker sends a packet with the same source and destination IP, and therefore the system hangs, attempting to both send and receive the message. The Echo Chargen attack. The Echo is a small service that sends back whatever it receives. A Chargen is a character generator. And so a combination of these two UDP services causes a constant loop of large amounts of data, probably guessed it, slowing down the system. Small services are an interesting topic. There are others as well. And ultimately, they're usually for testing purposes. Distributed denial of service. Routers communicate on port 179. So Cisco border routers and others communicate using that protocol in 179. This attack uses the routers as the quote-unquote man in the middle. And it could also use other devices on the network as well. Some real-world examples that are available. MyDoom, virus or worm that repeatedly mailed itself to all entries in a victim's address book each time the email was opened. A logic bomb then caused all of these hosts to attack, for example, a specific website at a predetermined time. You may remember this at some point in the past. And we have the Slammer, the fastest spreading worm ever. Scan for MS SQL Server Desktop Engine, and then exploited a commonly known flaw in that system. It was particularly vicious because it spread without human intervention. Its destruction could have been avoided. However, the patch for this flaw, its destruction could have been avoided. The patch for this flaw was released weeks before that attack. Obviously, though, needing to take full precautions prior to. In addition to the previously mentioned methods, we want to make sure in terms of defending against denial of service attacks that you configure your firewall to filter out incoming ICMP packets. Configure your firewall to egress filter for ICMP packets. Configuring your firewall to disallow any incoming traffic, which might be considered extreme. Use tools such as NetStat and others. We want to make sure that we're configuring internal routers to disallow traffic that did not originate within the network. Disable all IP broadcasts. Filter for external and internal IP addresses on the right side of the router. Keep AV signatures updated. Keep OS and software patches current. And have an acceptable use policy that clearly disallows certain behavior. In today's world, denial of service attacks are common. They are not necessarily sophisticated, and so they can be unsophisticated. In many instances, they are devastating. And so, as a professional, as just a regular human computer user, your job is constant vigilance.